Dawn on the Trenches is a war documentary inspired by a true story that captures the intense and harrowing experiences of a young group of Australian soldiers who joined the French Allied forces in World War I. These young men, full of ambition and dreams, were thrust into the brutal reality of war, forced to trade their youthful ideals for survival and maturity that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. In 1916, in the arid, remote west of Australia, young Jim lives a quiet life with his family, tending sheep on their farm. Like many young people, Jim yearns for something more, something beyond the endless stretch of desert around him. One day, after counting the sheep, his father finds some missing and sends Jim to look. When he returns, his friends Lex and John are waiting to persuade him to join the war. Initially, Jim refuses, but the call of adventure lingers. His father, sensing Jim's restlessness, urges him to stay, to remain with the family. Yet, Jim has made up his mind. He wants something more than tending sheep on the plains. That night, as Jim slips away to join the fight, his father stands waiting outside, handing Jim a pipe as an early birthday gift. His father's saddened gaze reflects a hope that Jim will change his mind, but Jim leaves, spurred on by the promise of adventure and duty. Once in France, the harsh realities of war grip Jim and his friends. Each day, the constant loss of comrades weighs on them as simple, makeshift graves appear throughout the battlefield. It doesn't take long before Jim's group is sent to the front lines, to the trenches where the constant rumble of artillery fills the air. In the darkness, their sergeant calls for volunteers to cut through the enemy's barbed wire, and Jim, along with Lex, John, and a new recruit named Harry, step forward to take on the mission. The group inches forward, the weight of silence pressing on them, each move requiring caution. As they near the German wire, John accidentally makes a noise. The Germans quickly respond by launching flares into the sky, illuminating the field and searching for intruders. Instructed by the sergeant to remain still, the group holds their breath, aware that even the smallest movement could mean death. Soon, 2 German soldiers approach. The sergeant hands Jim a dagger, counting to 3, and together they rush forward to confront the enemy. The sergeant swiftly kills one soldier, but Jim struggles. As he restrains the other soldier, he realizes the enemy before him is merely a terrified young boy. Though his blade is at the boy's throat, Jim finds himself unable to strike. In a moment of mercy, he lets the boy go and returns to his unit. As the group begins to retreat to the trenches, a second flare lights the night sky, and this time, fate is not on their side. A bullet pierces the sergeant's head, and he collapses instantly. Machine gun fire rains down, and Lex is the next to fall, followed swiftly by John. Watching his friends die one by one leaves Jim paralyzed, unable to react. Only when Harry returns to pull him away does Jim regain his senses, and together they stumble into a minefield. Harry steps on a mine, and in an instant, he is gone. In the bleak silence of dawn, Jim is the only one who returns to the trenches. Consumed by grief, he cries out to the heavens, calling each friend's name. The first rays of morning light fall upon him, illuminating a shattered man, left with nothing but sorrow and the heavy realization that the cost of war is devastatingly high. The next day, a lieutenant came to take a report on the previous night's losses. Jim recounted the names of each fallen soldier and narrated the tragic events. He also confessed that he had spared a young German soldier's life. The lieutenant looked at him for a moment before replying, "I wish you hadn't done that." He simply wrote in the report that the team had been attacked by German patrols, hoping this incident would teach Jim a hard lesson. Outside, rain poured down relentlessly as the remaining soldiers huddled in the trench, trying to keep warm in dugouts. Knickers, visibly distraught, asked Jim about his brother Harry's fate. Jim, unable to reveal that Harry had been blown apart, told him that Harry had been shot. Knickers was furious, especially when he learned Harry had died while going back to save Jim, who had returned alone. Just before tensions escalated, Ned intervened, stopping the argument. Knickers broke down in grief over his brother's death. A month later, a new sergeant named Biff arrived at the camp, exuding a brash energy with his cowboy hat and promise of rounds for everyone once the war was over. During lineup, Jim informed Biff about a machine gun on the German side, the very one that had killed his friends. Biff quickly devised a plan to seize it. Volunteers were needed, and Ned, Knickers, and a young soldier named Archie signed up immediately. That night, after a team of Red Cross medics checked on their wounds, the 5-man squad was assembled. They plotted to go around the enemy's flank, ambush the German machine gun nest, and escape quickly. The plan was executed in silence. A short burst from a rifle lured the Germans' attention away, allowing the team to sneak up on the German trench. As they approached, a flare went up, but Jim, remembering his sergeant's advice, closed one eye to preserve his night vision. When the signal came, the team rose to charge, only for another flare to light the sky. This time, they were lucky to remain undetected and swiftly attacked the Germans. Knickers, bent on avenging his brother, killed each one until he aimed at a young German boy. Jim stopped him, reminding him that the boy had surrendered, and any shot would attract enemy attention. The team took the boy prisoner, seized the machine gun, and returned to their trench. Back at the trench, Knickers interrogated the young German, demanding to know if he'd killed Harry. The boy, clueless and frightened, couldn't answer. The others calmed Knickers, insisting the boy was innocent. The following morning, with artillery pounding outside, medical personnel moved the wounded soldiers on stretchers. As they ate a meager meal of bread with jam, someone discovered a stash of wool socks nearby and secretly distributed them. Jim received a pair and, remembering Knickers, passed one along to him. On the way to a new location, enemy bombers flew overhead. Everyone hit the ground, faces buried in the dirt, as Biff stayed calm, even theatrically adjusting his helmet. Unfortunately, one of their men was injured. Jim ran to help him, but the sergeant shook his head. With wounds that severe, survival was unlikely. Despite this, Jim refused to abandon him. Archie stayed with Jim to get the man to the medics, but the triage line was overflowing, and the wounded man was not prioritized. The nurse handed Jim some opium to ease his pain. Jim left him a pair of socks before returning to the trench and giving the second pair to Knickers. On a quiet day without gunfire, the soldiers filled bags with mud to fortify their trench. The lieutenant came by and noticed the wool socks Knickers had on, demanding to know where he got them, as these were officer-issued items. Knickers insisted they were his, and no one contradicted him, though the whole unit received extra duties as punishment. While on break, they heard cries for help from a soldier caught in barbed wire. Jim moved to assist, but Knickers held him back, warning that any noise would make them German targets. The soldiers' desperate pleas haunted Jim, and eventually he couldn't ignore them. Braving the fog, he freed the trapped soldier, earning the admiration of his comrades for his courage and kindness. Through the harsh conditions, Jim, Archie, Knickers, and Ned became close friends, sharing stories of home. When Jim mentioned his family's sheep farm, they were stunned. Jim had no reason to be at war. Jim himself pondered this, but knew it was too late to turn back. They joked about visiting his farm after the war, a faint dream amid the bloodshed. One patrol went quietly, and as they laughed on their way back, a bullet grazed Knickers' head. They'd been discovered, and the enemy started lobbing grenades toward them. Incredibly, they escaped unharmed, barely clinging to life. On the 400th day, snow began to fall over the battlefield, forcing the soldiers to take turns warming up inside, where they exchanged brief talks about the future. The next day, noticing the Germans had temporarily retreated from their trench, one of Jim's friends suggested a shooting competition, daring Jim to hit an artillery piece across the field. Jim, amused, accepted and succeeded with one shot, leaving everyone in awe. Just then, their commanding officer arrived, but, to their surprise, didn't reprimand them. The sergeant even complimented Jim's accuracy. Moments later, a sudden explosion shook their trench as German forces bombarded them. Luckily, the team had prepared small dugouts along the sides of the trench, giving them just enough shelter. When the shelling finally stopped, they noticed Ned was missing. They scrambled to find him and soon discovered him buried under the mud. The 3 men frantically dug with their hands to free him. When Jim went to grab a shovel, another comrade stopped him, begging for help for his own brother. Jim assisted and managed to save the comrade's brother, but when he returned to Ned, it was too late. He had passed away. Furious, Knickers confronted Jim, demanding to know where he had been. The fight escalated, fueled by Knickers' lingering resentment over Harry's death, and Jim finally admitted Harry had died in an explosion, not from a gunshot, and couldn't have been saved. Both men were punished with extra trench-digging duty, where Jim's shovel hit the body of another fallen soldier, heightening their despair. Jim later received a letter from home informing him that his father had passed away from overwork. Devastated, he confided in Archie, expressing regret, believing he had caused his father's death and that he had failed his friends and Harry. Knickers overheard, but by now even he had come to accept that death was an inevitable part of war. Soon after, the French forces began an assault, pushing the Germans back on the Western Front. Desperate to recover lost ground, the German command sent wave after wave of soldiers, resulting in severe casualties. As supplies ran low, Jim and Archie volunteered to retrieve ammunition. On their way back, a bomb hit, injuring Archie's leg. German forces then released poison gas. Remembering Archie's injury, Jim ran back to help him, choosing a risky route over the trench wall to save time. Without a gas mask, Archie began choking, so Jim lifted him and sprinted toward safety. However, before they reached cover, a bullet struck the young soldier. Jim's heart broke as he called for a medic, but his efforts were in vain. Archie's final words were, "I want to go home." Tragically, he could only rest in the cold graveyard with his fallen comrades, leaving an immense sorrow among his friends. By 1918, after 773 days in France, Jim's unit was transferred to a location free from the mud and harsh weather. Their lieutenant encouraged them, saying they had one final objective: capturing an observation post on a hill. This victory, he promised, would bring them home. As they prepared, Patrick, a soldier Jim and Archie had once saved, visited to thank him, though he lamented that Archie wasn't there to share the moment. Another soldier captured a photograph of the remaining 5 comrades as a keepsake. That night, they slept under the open sky. At dawn, everyone took their positions. Some soldiers, terrified, felt their blood pressure drop, but were urged forward into ranks. The lieutenant gave them one last command: "Take the hill, and we go home." With explosions lighting up the sky, the soldiers charged through thick smoke, descending into the German trenches in hand-to-hand combat. Chaos erupted, and helmets were swung as weapons. In the heat of the melee, Jim found himself saving Patrick once more. The scene was utter bedlam. Every second, someone fell, with both sides refusing to back down. In this brutal, no-mercy clash, it seemed like a large-scale brawl among young men determined not to surrender. Just as Jim was nearly shot, Knickers spotted him and saved his life. After a fierce struggle, they finally gained their first victory by seizing a German ammunition depot. However, their position became an open target for the enemy artillery on the opposite hill. As soon as Sergeant Biff poked his head up, a volley of fire forced him to duck back down. He sent a runner to inform their commander of the situation, but the orders were clear. They were to keep advancing. Biff, undeterred, rallied his comrades. At his whistle, they charged forward, though some fell instantly under a relentless rain of bullets. Across the field, enemy soldiers fell in droves, but Knickers was soon hit by a mortar shell. Shrapnel lodged into his body, and he collapsed in the mud. Seeing him, Jim rushed to staunch the bleeding. Knickers, half-conscious, told Jim to leave him, reasoning that one survivor was better than both of them dying. But Jim refused, determined to save his friend. Using a broken piece of glass to assess the situation, he moved forward, taking out enemy gunners one by one, allowing the rest of the unit to advance. Jim then half-carried, half-dragged Knickers out of the line of fire, though Knickers drifted in and out of consciousness. Jim called desperately for a medic, apologizing to Knickers for everything and insisting he'd make it home to deliver letters and keepsakes himself. Medics finally arrived and carried Knickers away, while Jim, undeterred, rejoined the fight. Jim pressed on but was soon hit in the shoulder and stomach, the pain rendering him unable to move. Lying on the ground, he watched his unit continue their assault. They eventually managed to seize the observation post, fulfilling their objective. In the following days, however, their return home was delayed as fighting continued. Jim often pondered the purpose of the war, memories of his peaceful countryside home coming back to him. Then, one day, the mail carrier arrived with a notice that took everyone by surprise. Looking at each other in disbelief, the soldiers cautiously stepped out of the trench, waiting for some kind of confirmation. For a moment, the sound of gunfire in the distance held them back. But slowly, each soldier removed their helmet, and a collective sigh of relief, cheers, and laughter erupted as the news settled in. It was the 11th hour of the 11th day of November 1918. The armistice had been signed, signaling the end of World War I, a catastrophic war that took the lives of over 18.6 million people and left around 60 million wounded. The soldiers shared a cigarette in memory of their fallen comrades. Jim returned home to his waiting mother and sister, their embrace filled with both joy and sorrow. Visiting his father's grave, Jim, now a man shaped by war, felt a deep responsibility to care for his family and their land. Thus ends the film Sunrise in the Trenches. Though it lacked the grand battle scenes of other war films, it captured the devastating impact of war, illustrating the horror of World War I and the camaraderie that helped soldiers endure those harrowing years.